The Palestinian resistance, in my mind, is actually very small compared to what it should be against what they've had to experience. A Palestinian, whether you're Muslim or Christian or no faith, it didn't matter. The Israelis are saying, this is our land and you're going to be out of here. Now they say it overtly, right? There isn't going to be a Palestinian state. Where those people are going to go is another question. Yeah. But they're still saying it's no Palestinians, Christian or Muslim.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud. All about humanity, so this right here for everyone. Uplift, amplify, empower everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud.
Visit sumudpod.com to subscribe and connect with us on social media. You can also support our work by contributing monthly on the Support Us page. Even $10 a month helps us continue amplifying Palestinian voices and those in solidarity. Thank you.
On this episode of the Sumud Podcast, we uplift, empower, and amplify Mother Agapia. Welcome.
Thank you, Ed. Nice to be here.
So, quick shout out to Ibrahim Awad, the karate attorney, for connecting us. He's also the sponsor of the podcast, so I really appreciate him connecting us. I want to go over your bio. You're an American Orthodox nun who spent over a decade running a school in the Holy Land of Palestine. You led a girls' school in the West Bank, right, and have spoken about the struggles faced by Palestinian Christians under Israeli occupation. You're now based in New York, and you continue your mission through prayer, education, and public advocacy.
Sounds right.
So 99% right.
Right. Well, and also the thing you said, advocating for Palestinian Christians, but Palestinian Muslim, all Palestinians are in the same boat.
Yeah. And
need the same awareness of what's going on. Yeah.
I agree. Yeah. So, you know, everybody knows you because of Palestine and knows you obviously because of the Tucker Carlson interview, right, if we're going to be honest, right? Sure. But there's a story behind that. Right. What moments or life events led you to Palestine? Because I know you were planning to be a lawyer, which I think you had been a great lawyer, by the way. But what led you to Palestine?
Yeah. Well, just briefly, so I'm Greek Orthodox, raised in America. So in our church, my father was a priest, my grandfather was a priest. We moved around a bit. My parents always had an idea of helping other people. And even though my dad was a priest, they were kind of political in a way. We were in Ohio when I was in high school, and I decided to go to the University of Michigan with the idea that I would go to law school. I also liked the idea of the Peace Corps. I'm old enough to know when that was really active, going to another country and helping and working with people. So the idea was maybe to go to law school and use my talents that way. But then when I was a junior, I had been studying political science, and something in me was a little bit empty, studying political theory, and realized that wasn't the full answer. So that drew me closer to my faith at a deeper level, and it happened to be that there was a Greek guy from Ann Arbor going to a Russian, more traditional seminary. And I learned about that place, and then I ended up going to upstate New York, where they had a seminary, eventually became a nun. As my faith grew stronger, I just realized I wanted devoted all my time to serving God. I was there for a few years, but they kept all the services in the Russian language, and I felt like I wanted to be another place. And fortunately, as it turned out, that Russian church had 2 convents on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. So in May of '96, I got a blessing to go visit there. And it was a community with a wonderful abbess and about 30 nuns, most of them young, right across from the Dome of the Rock, the Wailing Wall. You know, you're in the heart of the world for most people of faith. I got a blessing, and I was allowed to live there at the convent. And the first year and a half, I didn't even go outside the gates of the monastery, or very rarely. This is May of '96, right, or September, I was living there. I wouldn't have known what was the old city or the new city of Jerusalem, what was Israel, what was Palestine. So that's how I got to Jerusalem, the first step.
Every fighter needs a cause. Every cause needs a fighter. The Sumud Podcast is sponsored by the Karate Attorney, fighting for justice inside and outside the courtroom. Visit karateattorney.com or follow on Instagram at karateattorney to learn more.
Can you briefly, to the best of your ability, describe your approach to religion or your perspective on religion versus, say, let's say Ted Cruz, for example, the differences?
We're jumping right to him.
No, we're going to talk about him later, but just not quite understanding the nuance.
Yeah. So I think the thing to be is that the Orthodox Church, which I'm part of, is the first church established in Jerusalem and then in Antioch and all throughout the Middle East. And then in the 400s and 500s, there were divisions, and the people, some who live in Syria and Iraq, took a little bit of a veer away from that first step. Then in the year 1054, there was a separation between East and West, what became the Catholic Church based in Rome, and everybody else in the East that were the original Christians.
Mm.
And then you get to Luther in the 1500s in Germany, and then that sort of opened the floodgates where the whole idea was protest, right? Protestants. So now throughout the world, you have Protestants who can be many different ideas. It's sort of, they all create their own church and viewpoint. So that's the essential difference between someone like Ted Cruz, who has an understanding that is far removed from the original Christianity that most of the Christians who live in Palestine and Israel today practice, or all throughout the Middle East, really.
Understood.
Okay.
That's very helpful. Thank you. 'Cause-
Okay,
Yeah.
no problem. Well, we can get to
No.
that later too, but the fact is you're a Muslim. So Islam developed in the 600s. Wasn't always a good history between Christians and Muslims, but the fact is throughout the Middle East, Christians and Muslims have lived together, and that's something we can go into a little bit more later too, about how people understand that relationship today.
So when you're waking up in
Mhm.
Jerusalem,
Yep.
describe that feeling.
It's cacophony, especially where I lived. You had one of the most prestigious or important Jewish cemeteries right below us. People want to be buried there because right across the road, the Kedron Valley, is the walls of the old city and the Golden Gate, or Beautiful Gate, the entrance to the temple.
Hmm.
So you have the intensity of Jews who go there to worship. And then right beyond that, there's a Muslim cemetery, and you have the Al-Aqsa Mosque right there, the third holiest site in Islam. So you have that intensity, reality of a spiritual life. Right now, there's very few pilgrims, whether they be Muslim or Christian, or Jewish for that matter, going to the Holy Land. But when I was living there, like I said, I lived within the gates of the monastery, but just over the walls, I could hear people from the Philippines, from Japan, from Germany, Italy, the whole world comes to worship there because it's the holy site and the center of Christ. And also, like, the Dome of the Rock covers the spot where they say that Abraham was going to sacrifice his son. So to Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, that's a real center. But at the same time as you have that bustle of all the world being there and looking for some sort of spiritual experience, there's also such peace. Sometimes I would be assigned to be at the gate of our convent when we would allow people to come in. They have to have a gatekeeper there. And I remember you'd hear a little bit of the bustle of cars, because you have the modern world there too, just starting the day. But I would be doing the Jesus prayer and also be in the most wonderful peace, because at the same time, what the people are searching for is that spiritual heart that, in my mind, comes from the fact that Christ walked there and conducted his life there. And you sense that. So it brings profound peace in the midst of all the bustle.
You said you didn't really leave the walls of that
For
area.
the first year and a half,
For the
yeah.
first year and a half. Is there a reason for that?
Well, because as an Orthodox nun, I think most people are more aware of Catholic nuns, and a lot of times they'll work in hospitals or teach in schools, whereas in Orthodox Christianity, it's much more an interior life of prayer. I'm a very atypical nun at this point in my life, but generally your life is one where 6 to 7 hours you're in services in the church, and then your abbess, the head of the community, assigns you an obedience. Some people might paint icons, or they work in the kitchen, or basic obediences during the day that are assigned by someone else. And you don't have much interaction with other people except for the nuns in the community. Supposed to not really indulge in conversations or watching shows or anything like that, because it's prayer in the church and then prayer in your cell and time for sort of inner contemplation. So that's really the typical life of an Orthodox nun. So there was no reason to go outside the walls.
Did you understand what was happening outside those walls?
At that time, very little, to be honest.
Hmm.
No, it was a world away from us. What did bring it home, I guess the thing was when I first moved there, right, May of 96, that was a time when there was hope for peace in Israel and Palestine. I was part of the Russian Orthodox Church then, the White Russian Church, those who were opposed to communism. We won't go into that it's a whole other book that you could write. But we had pilgrims, people in Israel and in Palestine, Christians from Bethlehem, I think, would come sometimes to visit. So you would hear a little bit about what life was going on the outside. But my understanding was at that time, things were relatively peaceful. There was hope because of the Oslo Accords that there would be peace between Israel and Palestine. And you certainly had a sense that there were people in Israel that were hoping for that too. And there was some interaction between people then. So that was my limited knowledge from 96 to September of 98. Then in September of 98, there had been some changes in our convent, and our church did happen to have a school in East Jerusalem, just over the Mount of Olives. It was established in the late 1930s, And the abbess at that time actually was an English woman. And the bishop told her, I want you to do something to help. Christians know the story of Lazarus and Martha and Mary. Lazarus was raised from the dead by Christ. That was in Bethany, which is now known as Al-Azariah, a corruption of Lazarus. So the Russian church had a property there. Originally, it was a clinic, and then it was organized into a Christian boarding school for girls from Bethlehem, which is about 7 miles away. That whole area would come and live there. And the abbess, Mary, would go on a donkey. She'd go from the convent of St. Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives and go over the Mount of Olives on the donkey about less than 2 miles away and be in Bethany to see how things were going at the school. And then, unfortunately, things changed in 1967 after the war. Many people from the Old City, many Palestinians, were forced out of the Old City. So Bethany became a much larger community and predominantly Muslim. So over time, by the time I got there, assigned to administer the school, it was a day school of about 350 girls from kindergarten through Taujihi, or senior in high school. And there's about 40,000 people, I think, at that time in Abu Dis, Isawiya, and Al-Azariah, where we were. So it was a day school, predominantly girls from Muslim background at the school, and about half our teachers were half Muslim, half Christian, not as a quota, it kind of just was roughly that way. And we also had a small number of boarding students who were Christian girls from difficult backgrounds. We had 3 nuns living there generally all the time, taking care of the girls. So in that way, I got to know some more about what the life was like for Palestinians. And that was September of 98. I'll stop for a second and we can continue the story about how things changed a couple of years after then.
Yeah, I'm just curious, when you finally left the walls of Jerusalem, is that the way to say it?
Yeah, you could say, oh, well, the walls of the convent.
The walls of the convent. Once you left,
Mhm.
did you realize, oh, something's not right here? What am I seeing?
Yeah, in the beginning, to be honest, when I reflect on it, in September of 98 and until May of 2000, life seemed rather routine. Like I said, there was still that hope of peace and movement towards that. So the reality of the occupation didn't feel so strong then. You didn't have a lot of checkpoints, but what really brought it focus for me was in May of 2000. That's when I began to understand what the Oslo Accords meant and what a charade they really were. As a political science major, it was so clear. People would say, how come the Palestinians do these violent acts against Israel? And don't they govern themselves? Well, the reality was there was never a Palestinian state created. It was always something that they had to earn. So instead of a state with its own freedom, own borders, you had Area A, B, and C. And where I came to understand that was that Area A meant the urban centers of Palestine had supposedly total control, right? They had their own police department, had the security concerns they took care of. They had a government that ran things for the civil aspect of society. Area B was like you have some sort of civil control. But I lived in Area B. And I remember once we had an incident where someone tried to take some of our property. And we called the police. Police didn't have a gun. That guy had a gun,
Yeah.
but they didn't have one. There was a fire on the outskirts of the school one time. We didn't have a good ability to call a fire department. Everything was done by charity. So there was no real organized state. And what happened in May of 2000 was, as part of the Oslo Accords, and this growing, is that Abu Dis and Al-Azariah were supposed to move from Area B to Area A. I don't know, they earned their stripes. But according to the prime minister at that time, Ehud Barak, they didn't meet the standards. So it didn't move from Area B to Area A. So that shows that was part of the frustration. They saw that the accords themselves weren't even being followed, that were giving them some sort of limited autonomy. And beyond that, you saw the greater development of the settlements. Often I went to Bethlehem and Bet Jala, and you saw mountain that used to belong to Palestinians and their land was now being built up. The Israeli governments were saying, yes, we're going to expand those settlements. They didn't even have people to live in those settlements, but they were expanding it on Palestinian land. And beyond us, so Jerusalem and the Old City were to the east of us. Getting my west of us. And then Mali Adumim, it was a settlement right beyond us in Bethany. And it was continuing to grow. When I first went there, it was relatively small, still had trailers. Now you go, it's a huge city stretching to Jericho, 15 miles away. So the thing is, we saw the reality of the fact that the Palestinians were being denied what the world was thinking they were having, of having a state. And then in September of 2000, it really blew up. when Ariel Sharon went on the Temple Mount with nearly, I can remember very clearly, with nearly 1,000 people. He had an entourage, and it was a big provocation. So things had been boiling because Palestinians were seeing they weren't getting any closer to their own freedom and autonomy. And so then he does this to sort of show that we're in charge too, even on the holy sites there, and everything, the Second Intifada began. And then you had the crackdown by the Israelis.
So Hamas wasn't the problem.
Hamas had nothing to do with it at that time. Nothing at all. There was no Hamas where we were. And that wasn't even the point of it. The point was that the problem was that Israel was not abiding by the agreements, and there was just growing frustrations from the Palestinians. To me, if you sincerely want peace, you try to make peace with your neighbors. You don't keep poking them in the eye. And instead, all they did was, that was 23 years ago, a generation of people. I had young girls who were 5, 6, 10 years old then, or teachers having their first child. And now 25 years, we're still going through the same thing on the West Bank, but only harsher. September 2000, Sharon goes on the wall. And I remember a few months later trying to drive to Ramallah, which is like 10 miles away at the most, to go to talk to one of our lawyers. I'm driving, and it was after school, so it was already getting dark, and the road had been jackhammered. And then I tried to turn a corner, and there were like a mound of dirt. So this was the beginning of how they began to imprison the Palestinians in their own land. The beginning of the wall, one time I was driving between the convent and trying to come back to the school one afternoon, and all of a sudden there's just big cement cubes in the middle of the road. And that was what started the wall and checkpoints. And the continued, basically, imprisonment of the Palestinians in their own land.
Did you witness, that's obviously an atrocity, but did you witness any shootings?
Yeah, very many.
Yeah.
And to be honest, where we lived in Abu Dis and Al-Azaliyah was not one of the more areas of resistance. In Nablus and Jenin, you had people who were not associated with Hamas, were simply young men who had seen their house get blown up, or their land confiscated, or their brother shot, and were taking up arms to fight against the Israelis who were on their land, invading with their jeeps every day. After 2000, we had a APC, an armed personnel carrier, outside a roundabout right in front of the school gates. First, it started with curfew time, and then it became they would just basically sort of occupying the town. But you also realized what can be done when the people have no weapons of their own. Basically, it took 2 or 3 jeeps. It got out one day that the Israelis had shot a guy in a doorway in Abu Dis. So the next time they call curfew, there's nobody on the street because they know if they do, they're going to get shot. And in fact, I can think of a couple incidences near the school, right outside on the main street we were, and the bedrooms of our border girls were on that street. And one morning I was looking out, the curfew had been called, and there was a young soldier, spoke Russian, and a Palestinian young guy was walking up to him. And I said, "Oh, brother, what's he doing?" And the soldier shot him in the eye. The guy was a deaf mute, was trying to just understand where he should go, what he should do. He was actually visiting family from Hebron, and they shot him. So that happened right outside our door. Another incident, it was the anniversary of the death of Yasser Arafat, and a brother of one of our young students. The boys were throwing rocks. By that time, the wall had been built, basically not more than half a mile from us, and they were throwing rocks to the soldiers that were near the wall. Tom Brady, a quarterback, couldn't have thrown far enough, to reach it. He was shot in the intestine. He survived, but he was shot. And then they had to take him to Maqasid Hospital because that was the closest hospital. But that was through checkpoints, the ambulances delay, and his family, it was very difficult for them to even go and see him 2 miles away on top of the Mount of Olives. So those are the kind of things that you began to see, how the Palestinians were experiencing the occupation.
So to be clear, the Israelis are going, it doesn't matter if you're Christian, if you're Muslim, if you're Palestinian, they're coming after you.
Yep. Yeah, they're not. Yeah, they're coming after because basically it's very clear, and now it's said openly. For how many years? Right, it's from 2000 to let's say 2016. They still mouth the words of a 2-state solution, and America just turned a blind eye to the continued building of the settlements. And what are the settlements? Imagine if all those white buildings with red roofs were tanks. So essentially, Israel's been conducting a war against the Palestinians in a different form for all these years. And so the Palestinian resistance, in my mind, is actually very small compared to what it should be against what they've had to experience. And it didn't matter. It was so a Palestinian, whether you're Muslim or Christian or no faith, it didn't matter. The idea is that the Israelis are saying, this is our land and you're going to be out of here. Now they say it overtly, right? Netanyahu now will say there isn't going to be a Palestinian state. Where those people are going to go is another question.
Yeah.
But they're still saying it's no Palestinians, Christian or Muslim.
So juxtapose the Israelis' treatment of Palestinians in general, Christians and Muslims,
Right.
with the treatment of Muslim and Christian Palestinians, how they treat each other and how they're a community.
Oh, I'll just say one thing separating the Israeli government from Israelis in general is that, sadly, I think when I was first there, I wouldn't have had such a negative feeling coming from everyday Israelis. But that has changed so much in the last 25 years. And I really blame someone like Netanyahu for that because he's playing with fire. You know, when I first went there, Rabin had just been assassinated 6 months before by a Jewish zealot. Basically someone of the same mindset as the current ministers now, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. And Netanyahu, he wasn't necessarily of that same mind of the religious zealotry, that the land of Israel there's a religious reason for it. But he sort of made a deal, I want to be in power, and so I'm going to use these people to accomplish what I want. So nowadays, even regular Israeli citizens, they don't have a comfortable relationship, whether it's a Palestinian, Christian,
I mean,
or
they're
Muslim.
being educated in their schools. There's a lot of, on social media specifically, they're being educated in their schools
the
to hate
opposite.
Palestinians.
Yeah, I have seen that firsthand because, like I said, we also had girls of Russian background that lived with us. So they lived within the state of Israel, in Haifa, Tiberias, and I have some communication with them. And yeah, you get a sense of how hateful feeling towards the other side. That was part of the deal, is that it's inculcated into them to be fearful of Palestinians. And then now, because of the buildup of the wall and the separation, real separation between the two, the parents, 20, 40 years ago, people would have actually known someone on the other side. Now all they know is a soldier.
Yeah.
And on the Israeli side, they're indoctrinated to believe that this is the enemy instead of seeing it as people you can live with. Yeah.
So talk about the community of the Palestinian Muslims and Christians, how they live next to each other, how they're neighbors. And I mean...
Well, like I said, first of all, we can just start with the school itself. Well, I guess I never really believed the narrative of sort of a jihadist Muslim type. And then being there, I was warmly welcomed into the community. I tell the story often. When I first went there, I was walking down the street where I was first assigned to the school, and an old Palestinian man said to me, "Ah, are you with Theodosi?" And what he meant was across the street from the school was a Greek monastery, and there was a Greek monk there, priest, and he was very well known to the Palestinian community and honored. One, because he had saved the life of King Hussein when he was a child. They killed the grandfather of King Hussein, and Father Theodosi had been in the entourage, and he basically covered the 10-year-old Hussein and saved his life. So for that, he was honored. But also, when he died, it was 2 years before I came, but I heard from other people, the whole town came to his funeral, predominantly Muslim, because he had always been one who helped people, whether it was listening to them or giving them food or clothing. So right away, I understood that the connection between Muslim and Christian was that they were all Palestinians in this together. And within the school, a lot of times we had crosses and icons in the school, and there was no problem with that. And the way that I dress was like many of the women did. In some ways, I felt more connected to some of the faithful Muslim teachers that I had who practiced their faith. And yes, I'm not going to, look, I believe in Christianity. I believe it's the true way. But there's certainly a commonality between the basic precepts. Fasting, almsgiving, prayer. And one wonderful thing I noticed in the basically Muslim community is that it dawned on me one day, you didn't see a beggar. Older people lived at home. There was such a strong family connection. And that's both Muslim and Christian. So I think both of them, they recognize or respect their different holidays. I've heard stories. I was with a Muslim doctor not long ago, and he was actually from Lyd, which was in the 48 side, and now where the airport is, for example. There was St. George, a well-known church where the tomb of St. George is, and he remembers as a child going there to celebrate on the Christian holiday. And in fact, I think I even saw photographs just last week, or it was 2 weeks, in November, Muslims and Christians both being at the church. Yeah. And a respect for each other.
Yeah. You never go hungry visiting a
No,
Palestinian
definitely
family.
not in the Palestinian hospitality. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Very much. And in fact, there's many similarities. I remember it's kind of a sad occasion, but there was a case where a young girl from our school, she had an illness and had passed away. And just like we have in the Christian, you went to the family, went to the home, and even a very conservative thing where women went only to the women's side to pay their respects and men to the men. And that was very related to me as an Orthodox Christian, something very connected to. And all people went, whether they were Christian or Muslim, to pay their respects. Yeah. So those kind of faithful religious traditions, there might be a little variation, but they both follow them. There's a lot of similarities there too.
How many Christian Palestinians are there?
It's really decreased. It's about less than 2% of the population now. Yeah, and so it's in less than 100,000 within Palestine.
How does it make you feel that, I mean, we're all human. We we don't want anybody to be harmed, Christian or
Right,
Muslim.
yeah.
But for you specifically, with regards to your faith, how does it make you to feel that your tax dollars are contributing to essentially the death of your people?
Right. Yeah, I think it's a horrifying thing that's going on now, and I appreciate even being able to talk here because it's shocking how Americans and American Christians in particular aren't aware of what's happening to their brothers and sisters.
But can I ask you really quick?
Sure.
Are they not aware, or do they not care?
To be fair, I think in a lot of times they're not aware. I went to an event in Cleveland with some people that knew, but this other man who was an Orthodox Christian wanted to talk to me about something else. And so we had gone out to have coffee before then. And I brought up about the St. Porphyrius Church, where 17 Orthodox Christians were killed October 19th, 2023, in the church hall. And he had no idea of it. You have to, even you're someone who's more aware of these things. Most people now, how much do they watch of the news? And what they watch, the message given to them is that Hamas, they're all Muslim terrorists and they're out to get us too. So that's what's in their mind. So even if they see something that portrays the other side, first you have to be one who's aware and follows news, whether it's readable in mainstream media or not. And then it's presented so weakly in America that honestly, I really think unless you care about the issue, you don't. What I have found is I've begun to go and visit churches and things. I'll tell some of these stories about what's happened to Christians in particular, and people, they truly are in shock. It's like they don't know the story. And so, and one, they hear very little of it. And two, like I said, even when they hear it, it's presented in such a way that, oh, the real problem is just those terrorists, and then it'll be okay. And not understanding that the problem is not a religious one, Muslim between Jew, or is some sort of religious zealots against another. It's the occupation by Israel, a political problem.
Yeah.
So I think it does have to be expressed. For
I mean, I experience the same issue,
Right,
by the way.
yeah,
I have these conversations, people are unaware.
yeah.
But then I ask them, usually as a follow-up, and at this point it gets a little uncomfortable sometimes
Right.
for them. Well, what are you going to do now?
Right.
What do you ask them to do immediately?
Yeah.
If any?
Well, the thing is that people are somewhat sympathetic because of the horrors of Gaza. Yes, that's seeped through enough that people understand that there's something tragic and a big problem here. So that's opened eyes a little bit. But then basically the response is, so where do I write a check or how do I help? And my answer right now, it's born of frustration, is that, like I said, I moved there in 96. I've seen a generation of kids who now have kids who are suffering through the occupation. I don't mean just the Palestinians, Muslim or Christian, also on the Israeli side. Their society has become very fractured, a lot of psychological problems. It's nothing healthy for the people over there. So way we can help as Westerners is not so much just to give money, but we have to start advocating. And Christians have that responsibility to say, one, a moral sense, this genocide should not be continuing, and weapons that our country gives to them should not allow to be done. We have to put the money into other resources, and we have to say to our Congress people, we want the money to be used. We want you to change policy. It's like we keep putting a Band-Aid on the problem and kicking it down the road. I don't want to hear about a new phase of developing a Palestinian state. That's just continuing the lie. The chronic sore just grows. Because in reality, I would say to the Israelis, what do you think your government is doing? You've been slaughtering people for 2 years, and they're still there. And we still have the West Bank, which you're continuing to tighter and control, confiscate the land, make it smaller places for the Palestinians to live. but they're still living there.
Right.
So where's the solution? It's not by continued occupation, and it's not going to help you because you've basically drawn the hatred of the world now in a very tragic way, as we saw the other day in Australia, if that is indeed what caused that person to do the shooting. But the thing is, we have to come to people to advocate, and the key is the United States, right? With our dollars, both by giving the weapons to them, keep continuing to vote to give them weapons, continuing to allow nonprofit organizations to exist in America that support settlements in Israel, and to continue the diplomatic cover. That we put sanctions on Francesca Albanese, a person who's trying to show and demonstrate the human rights violations that have taken place, and we allow a Ben Gvir and people who are killing American citizens on the West Bank to get away with it.
To visit the White House.
And we, at a drop of a hat, I'm no friend of Vladimir Putin, believe me. There's a lot of history there. But Russia has done 1/10, if that, of the violence and the killing of civilians and the occupation of land on Ukraine that Israel has done on Palestine. Yet there is extreme sanctions put on every conceivable Russian influential person.
As Palestinians know, education is resistance. Join us at the School of Radical Imagination, where community-based learning turns knowledge into action. Starting this January, you can take courses like Capitalism versus Love with Dr. Laura Basu, or Embodying Liberation with friend of the podcast, Ashira Darwish. Learn more and register at radicalimagination.school.
You're asking these individuals who you speak to speak up, to talk to their politicians.
To talk to the congresspeople, which unfortunately, what I found after I left Jerusalem in 2006.
You were forced to leave, correct?
In a sense, yeah. There was two things going on. One was in April of 2005, I had gone to Washington to speak about how the wall and the occupation was affecting our community. I couldn't get to my convent for church services. Our teachers couldn't come easily from Bethlehem. The wall wasn't providing security because it was separating Palestinian family from Palestinian family, at least where we were. So what kind of security is that? So I had gone and spoken to a few congresspeople and aides and things in D.C., April 2005, and I come home, and my abbess says to me, Mordecai Levy from the Jerusalem mayor's office was here, and he said, what was Mother Agapia doing in Washington? And she said, don't worry, she won't be at the school anymore. And then there was some issues with church politics. In February of 2006, I left Jerusalem.
So I bring that up because that's the reason a lot of people don't want to speak up.
You're going to get a backlash. Yeah.
What's your message to those individuals who are afraid to speak up for losing wealth or their jobs or whatever it may be?
Well, we all have to look at our conscience. I don't judge anyone. We're all called to do different things. Perhaps in a way it's easier as a nun, as a monastic. Certainly, I do still have my natural family, but, in a sense, I'm my own person. But to anyone, I would say, certainly at this time, for our politicians, look, at this point, at this juncture, after Gaza, we have to make the comparison to the time of the Holocaust. If you want to talk about the Holocaust, then we have to talk about when do we say that money and wealth and reputation don't matter in the face of the moral atrocities that are taking place. So that's what I would say to our politicians. And the sad thing is, at least my experience where I'm living in upstate New York, so after I left, I kept my ties to the Holy Land, to Palestine, because basically from about 2009, every year I bring groups of pilgrims twice a year when we can to visit the Holy Land. So I kept connections with the Christian, with all Palestinians that I knew there while we do our trips. And as well, I would bring Palestinians to America, young Christian Palestinians, for the summer to spend at our convent. So I've kept close ties with the community. And that allows me to see how the occupation has continued and become more and more oppressive.
You say Holy Land in Palestine.
Yeah. That's it.
Palestine specifically. Given what you've seen, now I'm asking this question more from a religious perspective.
Sure, yeah.
From a religious perspective, does Israel have the right to exist?
From a religious perspective, I don't think the recognition of a state is really a religious question. My problem with the state of Israel, it's pretty tough to decide how can you be both a Jewish and a democratic state. So I would say as a state, the world determined it happened. Okay, so there is a state of Israel, but there should have been a state of Palestine as well. If you're going to be a democratic state, that doesn't mean that you occupy another people. And what I also have a problem with is that which I came to realize after living there, is that they don't have a constitution. The same things that they claim about Iran and being an Islamic state, they are a theocracy,
Right.
a Jewish state. And in fact, I think a lot of even Jews probably don't even recognize, they don't recognize Reform and conservative Judaism. So many Jews in America who get married here, it wouldn't be recognized in Israel.
Yeah.
That's the problem. If they're going to exist as a Jewish state, that's the problem.
But the Israelis, the Jews
Mm-hmm.
in Israel,
Mhm.
believe that it is their religious right to have a state of Israel. The Christian Zionists,
Mhm.
Ted Cruz,
Mhm.
Mike Huckabee,
Mhm.
believe that religiously Israel has a right to exist.
Right.
What do you say to those individuals?
No, we're not talking about are your borders based on the Bible or on UN resolutions. That's the distinction
Right.
between the two. It's a great shame for the American ambassador to describe the West Bank as Judea and Samaria. I mean, in America, we have separation of church and state. There's two different things going on here. There's democratic and equal rights and human rights. The concept of a religious state of Israel, no, has to be rejected.
What is wrong with Mike Huckabee and Ted Cruz?
Well, what's wrong is I have a feeling that Huckabee, and I'm not sure of Ted Cruz, but Huckabee himself, he's a true believer in the sense we talked about the development of Christianity from the original, or if you go to Bethlehem or you go to Jerusalem, we call it the Holy Sepulchre where the tomb of Christ is, or to Bethlehem, the Church of Nativity, those are Orthodox Christians, and then Catholics in those sites, and some Lutherans. They are the traditional Christians. And the sad thing is, those evangelical Christians that espouse the beliefs that Huckabee and Ted Cruz do are far divorced. I would say that they're a false theology, and they're not representing Christianity. And I would also say to them is that, one, everybody can have their belief, whatever it is. In my mind, it's a wrong belief that's leading to tragic consequences here. And that even just put it at an elemental level of what a Christian should be. Even if you believe that the temple should be rebuilt, you don't do it by slaughtering other people or by denying the human rights of other people. And I think they have to come to their senses on that.
Tricky question again, just
Okay.
from a religious perspective.
Uh-huh.
Okay. If Mike Huckabee is following something completely different than Christianity, what happens to Mike Huckabee in the hereafter? From your perspective.
Right. Well, what we say, it's called a heresy, and that means you made a different choice. And that, the beautiful thing, powerful thing for me is that I told you I lived in the convent on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the temple, and right above us was a monastery called Dominus Flevit, a Catholic church. It says where Christ wept over Jerusalem. All of this is a tragedy to me. Huckabee and Cruz and their belief system is a tragedy because they call themselves Christian. But what Christ wept over was that people didn't recognize that he was the Messiah. So if you're a Christian, you believe, yes, in the Old Testament, we had the tribes of Israel, and they were to follow a law that would lead them to Christ, the new Israel. And then Christ wept because some of the Jews alive at that time didn't accept him. Not all of them, some of them didn't accept him. And those people that followed, that call themselves Christian, evangelical Christians, and put so much importance on rebuilding the temple and a state of Israel, Christ is weeping over them. They've missed the message. They're actually not seeing the Messiah and what he told, what he preached.
Do you really think, though, it's religious and not so much monetary? For somebody like Ted Cruz specifically?
Look, none of us can speak to anyone's heart. Like I said, I think I have a sense with Huckabee, because I believe he's a preacher as well, that this is something he was raised in and believes. Actually, I get asked all the time, how do we respond to these people? And in Orthodox Christian theology, we have this concept of prelest or delusion. And I think with some people, the only way it can sort of be prayed out. It's so deeply ensconced in their thinking that it's God's help to get them to change their mind. But I don't think that's everybody. And so then before we get to the Ted Cruz or a monetary or financial consideration, I think there's many Christians, and there's a group called Telos Group. There was an Orthodox Christian and an evangelical Christian who both used to work in the U.S. government, and they've created a Telos Group, and they're reaching out to evangelicals around the country. They had 800 people, Christ at the Crossroads, a conference in Chicago last month. Little by little, what I'm getting at is that, so some so deeply believe what they believe that it would be very hard. You can't talk to them to get them change. But a lot of other people, if you approach them that, your belief system has consequences. And it has consequences for people who are Christians in Israel and Palestine, for that matter. And I think what we're seeing is, maybe some of your audience is aware, Israel is putting millions of dollars now in. They're targeting in 4 states, California, Colorado, Nevada, one other, millions of dollars, pinpointing every evangelical church in those 4 states. And they're doing something called geofencing, where if anyone walks into those churches, they're going to get a message on their phone, and it's going to be Israeli propaganda telling what to do. So if Israel has to use those kind of efforts with the evangelical community, they recognize that people are beginning to get the message that there's something wrong with our policy towards Israel. And then we have the other factor is, which separates, maybe they use someone like Ted Cruz. I don't know his heart. But if he's a politician and money counts, sure. So if he's getting money from AIPAC or the Christian Evangelicals, the Christians United for Israel, CUFI, Pastor John Hagee, these are Christian lobby groups that are putting lots of money into politicians supporting Israel. Sure, that's a factor too. And that's where we have to have the education of Christians in America to other Christians to realize that you have to speak out now. Another thing, too, that isn't put out in the mainstream media is how many Jews in America are speaking out about how wrong this policy is. I went to one of the first demonstrations in D.C., like October 15th, I think it was, and there was about 1,500 of us, and we walked towards the congressional buildings, Rayburn Building and Cannon Building, and it's getting to dusk, and we're standing outside, and I didn't know what was going on, but then there was a big paddy wagon, and people were giving out cheers once in a while. Hundreds of Jewish Voice for Peace people were inside the rotunda and were peacefully protesting and allowing themselves to be arrested. That's not talked about, not in our name. And I think a lot of Christians have to wake up and say, not in our name, and make that become a political force. Just like those evangelical Christians, CUFI, the organizations that have been supporting politicians to make them take votes that continue to support Israel by allowing them to have the weapons to continue the occupation. Other people, and not just Christians, all moral people have to speak up and say, we don't want our tax dollars going to support this occupation anymore, and we're going to make it by our votes translated in, and our money in supporting who we're going to elect.
So a 2-part question. We're going to wrap up the Ted Cruz Huckabee component. You mentioned prayer as a solution. Are you praying for Mike Huckabee and Ted Cruz?
Well, I pray, certainly. In our church, it's a much more structured prayer. So there's actually a prayer that we do every day, just asking for peace in Israel and Palestine, and to speak peace into the hearts of the rulers. So in that sense, yes, praying for someone to open their eyes to see, what your policies are doing.
And if you were in front of Mike Huckabee or Ted Cruz right now, what message would you give them?
I'd say, if you're truly a Christian in heart, come and see. Don't just spend your time on one side of the wall. Come and see the Christians who are actually living there and praying. And then you tell me if what you're doing is really constructive and is Christ-like.
Hasn't Huckabee done that before?
He went to Taiba. He went to the wall, but he stopped. Basically, he only satisfied himself. He spoke the words because Taiba is still primarily a Christian village about 15 miles from Jerusalem, and there's been many attacks by settlers, burning cars, putting hateful graffiti on the walls, and confiscating. I was there in September, and I clearly saw armed settlers with rifles that are supplied by the U.S. and then distributed to the settlers, and they were on tractors plowing up the land that belonged to Palestinian Christians there. And he came to there and he spoke and he said, well, we have to do something about this. The only thing he did was appeal to the Israeli government because certain evangelical Christians were being denied visas to come visit Israel. Another thing that is Israel, that is supposedly the democracy and the best friend of the Christians, if you don't belong to the traditional Christian churches, Orthodox, Catholic, or Lutheran, you don't even have a right to have a church in Israel. And you certainly can't do missionary work. So what kind of people are these people supporting, these evangelical Christians, when you're not even respected as a Christian there? You're only respected for your money to help continue the occupation. With Huckabee, I think, like I said, I think he's one that's a true believer type. But then again, whether you're a believer or not, it just reminded me of the early 2000s when Republican, Darrell Issa, and Carolyn Maloney, a Democrat, they consented to come and visit me on the Mount of Olives. I was at the school then, and at that time the wall was sort of being constructed, so that was still like a case where you had spaces between it, and you had Israeli soldiers watching, but Palestinian women would have, a big something on their head, and they're walking through. And I took both of them to the location on the Mount of Olives where they were constructing the wall. And they basically cursed Israel at that time. They thought it was disgraceful what they were seeing there. But I can guarantee you that didn't change their vote when it came to supplying, voting yes again for weapons for Israel. So that becomes back to the point. It's a political problem for most politicians and people. And so the Americans, Christian, and all people of goodwill have to realize that this has to change the policy.
Yeah, but Huckabee and Ted Cruz, they seemingly are okay with the destruction of Palestine, the Palestinian people. If they were a Muslim, they would be considered jihadist politicians.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, it's the flip side of it. Just like you have the people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, they do have a religious philosophy. This is their land, and they're going to take it. It's a theocracy. Sure. And before them, I remember Mike Pompeo, who's a West Point graduate and all that. They speak the language of theology, which is incredible that they're getting away with that.
So describe your experience visiting Congress and sort of walking through the halls of Congress. Are they welcoming you with open arms, or how are they treating you?
No. I mean, today I haven't done much of that yet. And my point is eventually to leave that to other people. I actually am inspired as I've gone and visited a lot of young people. When you tell them the story, well, how can we help? What can we do? And not in the Christian context yet, the traditional one, but I've seen, there have been an organization of Catholic groups that have now trained young people, educated them on the issues, and they've gone to the Hill and talked to their congresspeople. So we have to do a lot more of that. I've seen that with Muslim organizations where kids have come from Georgia or from Michigan and other states. They spend a weekend here in D.C., and then they go and advocate on the Hill. But right now, it's still pretty intimidating. You walk down the halls of Congress, and you'll see some places where the Israeli flag is hanging, and so it's almost like we're in occupied territory in Congress. So there's a big challenge. And also, I was starting to say before, I take pilgrim groups, and I take younger people in the summer, older people in the wintertime. And I've had some of these older people in upstate New York try to go and visit their congressmen. Democrats, the congressmen won't even open the door, their aides, to talk. They just want to explain their experience of how they came on a pilgrimage. And not only did they go to the holy sites, but they visited Christian families in the West Bank, and they saw how their olive trees had been destroyed, or how they weren't able to use their land anymore, or how someone they knew had been shot. And the congressmen don't want to hear the stories. They don't want to hear it, and that's a disgrace. We're supposed to be a representative government. Where is this where they won't even hear you?
Yeah. Are we going to win this thing politically?
I think the tide is changing, turning, very much so. I mean, it's a palpable difference between this year, 2 years ago, let's say, because of the tragedy of Gaza, opened the door. And then people like Tucker Carlson. I mean, I think there is hope because you have both the left and the right beginning to say, maybe for different reasons, but that this policy can't continue. And the very fact that Israel's putting so much money into it shows that they're afraid. So can it happen? As a religious person, you say that the victory has already been won, because that's one message that I should be able to give too, is that something beautiful about the Palestinians, whether they're Muslim or Christian, is you see their enduring faith. And I mean real faith. Because if you're a believer, you believe there's a world after this one. So ultimately, whether you have a successful, wealthy life in all luxury, or you have a difficult one, it's how you conduct yourself in that life that's going to determine what your reality will be in the next life. They express the virtues of Christianity, peace, meekness, long-suffering. I've seen that time and time again for both the Muslims and Christians. I know my hands are in the hands of God. And that's really a message that all the world should learn and that we're not hearing enough. So they've actually given us so much in their suffering of how to act and believe. So there's hope in that way, in that if they can act in a way that's pleasing to God, they're going to get the ultimate victory. But practically speaking, I think that certainly we at least have to keep trying. And I do think realistically that I don't see how in another 3 or 4 years, Israel has lost the public support in America. It's like you can't put the genie back in the bottle.
Yeah.
So everybody knows what's going on. So there's no way that the votes are going to change. And so instead of people feeling hopeless, we're going to take the first steps today and start doing it, because 4 years down the road, it's finished. The generation of college students, maybe they're silenced on their campuses now, but they know what happened.
Yeah.
And when they become the leaders of this next generation, Israel's not going to have the support to do what they're doing. My prayer is that it's for the sake of those in Israel and those in Palestine, that time comes quicker, sooner rather than later, so that more people don't have to die.
I have so much respect for you because you're speaking up, you're speaking
Mhm.
out. Young people would say you're standing on business, if you will. I don't know.
Standing on business?
Yeah, apparently that's a thing.
I don't know what that
I don't
means.
know either, but that's what they say. We'll just go with it. It's hip,
Okay,
apparently.
all right.
But after that Tucker Carlson interview, have you been attacked?
No. Surprisingly, I mean, it's very humbling. Mostly the interaction just from hearing from people on the messages and things, overwhelmingly positive. And it's a pity that an old white American has to be the voice, but both from Muslims all around the world and Palestinian Muslim and Christians is that they're very grateful that there's someone giving them a voice that's humanizing them, that's showing the reality of the situation and not this false narrative that's been given for so long. That we're regular people, that we love our children, we want to educate our kids, we want to live in peace, Muslim and Palestinian and Christian together. And that I feel a great responsibility in that, is that, for whatever reason, God, and believe I do everything with a blessing, which is important. So I feel that it's like, no, it sounds presumptuous to say that God is doing this, but with taking that responsibility is that if I'm in this position to speak for those people, then I'm grateful to do that. And that's been the overwhelming message that I got. And as far as actually personal contact, it happened just a few weeks after the interview. I had a planned trip to go to Istanbul, to Amman, and to Palestine. And everywhere I went, it's like selfies. Recognized on the street. And it's people chasing me down from South Africa, or an Italian couple in a Greek church in Istanbul, and young guys here in D.C. who say, here's... And so maybe people have a negative reaction, but physically, only one time has anyone said anything negative to my face. I had just flown back from Jordan. It was like 4:30 in the morning at JFK Airport, and I had to catch a flight to Detroit. And some woman came up to me, and she says, "You're an anti-Semite, and you don't condemn Hamas." And I was tired, and I said, "I got my next flight," and I said, "I don't think I'm an anti-Semite." And that was the only person that has come up in a negative way. And some people have said, if you're concerned or threatened, because I think I'll be speaking in many different places around the country now. And someone even brought up the other day, should we have security for it? I haven't felt that. Tucker interviewed Francesca Albanese the other day, I said, and he asked her, what is it? What weapons do you carry? And I loved it. She used the line, "I have my pen." And my answer is, I have the cross.
Yeah.
And so with that, you go everywhere.
Francesca's great. She was actually on this podcast as well. So it's interesting. When I told a couple of people I'm interviewing you, they all said you're interviewing the Palestinian nun.
I'm Greek American.
Yeah, they think
grew up outside the city, but I'm an honorary Palestinian.
You're an honorary Palestinian.
Yeah.
The accent, you have the accent pretty well, better than me, by the way.
True, baby. I don't speak any language. Barely speak English.
Yeah.
No, it's true.
But that, and then when I gave you the Zaatar, your first question, which is
of course, yeah.
ultimately Palestinian, is where did you get the Zaatar from?
Which town? Which village?
Which town? Yeah. So just, I think my question really is, you mentioned on the Tucker Carlson interview the concept of Sumud, and this podcast name is Sumud. What did you witness? What type of Sumud, if you will, did you witness?
Well, I can repeat some of the stories. I realized I was copying a line from Hanan Ashwari. There's a movie called The Stones Cry Out, a documentary about basically the Christians in the Holy Land, but she says in there, this was our land, this is our land, and this will be our land. And that's, it's so painful to me. And to the credit, I think, or it's a way of coping, so many Palestinians have gone through these time of humiliation, of real oppression, but they handle it, you always see a smile. And not only that, it's like, okay, you uprooted my olive trees, I'm going to take it, I'm going to plant them over here. You smashed my car, I'm going to stand up on the top of it. They take their tanks and roll them over on purpose. I'm sitting on that car and I'm smiling, and we'll go and get another one. That's why this isn't going to end well for Israel, because they are rooted to the land. And the resilience is also not just because it's land, it's because it's just the dignity of the people. It's a very humble dignity, and it's very beautiful to see and inspiring. So that's why I consider a great honor if I'm even called to be the Palestinian nun. And I think what makes it so, I'm getting away from what the resilience is, but what's so beautiful about it is that I think they're also rooted, that resilience to me comes because they're closer to the idea of a creator and of another world. So that gives them the strength to endure it. I thought of it another time. You talk about the hospitality. It doesn't matter what's going on. They're very offended if, you come to someone's house and you don't take the time to sit with them. And in time, there's like a timelessness. And they're not backward. Palestinians are very educated and honor education and the arts and culture. But with whether it's someone who has a PhD or someone who works as a carpenter, you come into their house and that time is for you now. Yeah. And I think because that's the timelessness, that they're not governed by the clock and by how so much of the Western world is. They're governed by the steps of life, the rhythm of life that comes from creation, from the Creator. Yeah.
Your brother, George Stephanopoulos, for everybody, just so they're aware, he worked for the Clinton administration.
He did, yeah.
He did at one point, and he's also in the media.
Right.
How does he view what you're doing right now?
Well, it's a little bit difficult because he's in the challenge is he's part of the mainstream media, and they're pretty constrained in America right now. So I think he's in a position where I would hope that he'd be able to speak out more, but I think it's very difficult to do so.
Yeah. We'll leave it there.
Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah.
I just want to thank you so much for everything that you're doing and speaking out. I don't know if enough people are thanking you. I hope many of us are.
That's not good for a monastic. It should not to be praised. Yeah. No, and like I said, that thankfulness creates an obligation. It's not for me. It's for that we achieve that goal.
But you could just as easily live in New York and not pay attention to any of this and live a happy life. Right. But you're choosing to do this.
Well, it wouldn't be a happy life.
It wouldn't be a happy
because I don't know how much time we have, but I can end with a story. Certainly, most of the Christians are located within the West Bank, but we also at the St. Porphyrius Church. There's a young priest there, Father Silas. He would be very embarrassed I use his name, but the point is that the story with him is, first, he's from outside Haifa, so he's an Israeli citizen. And second, he studied to become a priest in Cyprus, came back, and in April of 23, he was made a monk, a monastic, so he didn't get married. And then he was ordained to the priesthood to serve a community. August of 23, he's sent to Gaza as his first church.
Wow.
So imagine, you're a young priest and your first assignment is there, and 2 months later, the tragedy strikes there. And now he's got his whole flock and other people living under the roof there and having to care for them. And within the middle of October, having many people killed, and so many have died untimely deaths during that time. So that's so what I'm getting is, so for myself, yeah, sure, I could stay in the convent and not say a word for what I've seen. He could have chosen to say, get me out of here. You put someone else there. But he didn't. So certainly as a person of faith, but any human being, we all have these choices, and then we have to live with them too. So for my conscience, I couldn't live with myself, and I think he couldn't have lived with himself and say, okay, now I can go back and live relatively safely in Israel, but then he wouldn't live anymore.
Do you keep in touch with him?
I have contact with him, limited contact, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. It's difficult. I want to say, though, it's difficult because, you also have to consider when you talk to people now, even in the West Bank, there's a Christian family that had their factory blown up in Nablus. And then now do I talk about that case? Because it was blown up in Nablus, in the West Bank, but it was Israelis who did it on purpose, the government, with no explanation of why they were doing it. So if I talk about that, where's their safeguard that the Israelis aren't going to do more to them? We have to be very careful when we talk about things.
I know you're not going to like this next question.
Okay.
But how do we support you? What can we do to support you?
You can support me by doing the actions that will help bring peace to Palestine.
And would you like to tell us those actions?
Yeah, definitely. One thing, especially right now for the Christmas season, like I mentioned before, the Telos group, they started an initiative called the Red Candle. So go to redcandle.org. November 29th was the first day at the birthplace of Christ in Bethlehem, the church there. The Palestinian Christians lit a red candle, and now they're asking basically to put it all out on social media. Everybody light a red candle, put it on your social media, and say, I'm lighting this candle some people may have been there. So I'm lighting this candle for Father Isa in Bethlehem and remembering the Christians in Palestine and that there may be peace there. So you can do things like that. And there's a wonderful group called Heal Palestine. There's different ways that we can help people monetarily, but also, like I said, the thing is, if you've heard these words, educate yourself. Learn more, go to telosgroup.org. Forget the mainstream media. Go and listen to someone like Max Blumenthal or the Drop Site News and educate yourself on what's going on. And then if you're so called, take those steps to say to your politicians, why are we spending our dollars continuing this genocide and continuing this occupation? That's the best gift you can give to me.
Great. When are we going to start the Mother Agapia podcast?
No, actually, a savvy relative of mine said that's something I should do. But no, my main purpose is to pray. I'll come visit podcast.
There you
We'll
go.
leave it at that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Any final words?
The main purpose for my being here is, look, I want to be able to go to the quiet of my cell and devote myself to prayer. But until the occupation ends, until America stops supporting Israel with this occupation, I'm going to have to keep coming to speak.
Thank you so much for
Okay.
your time. I
All
really
right,
do
that's
appreciate it.
it.
Yeah.
No problem. I hope it gets something useful.
It was amazing. Thank you
All
so
right,
much.
that's
Yeah.
good.
Listen, stay tuned, cause it's time for Sumud.